Yo, what is going on, guys? Welcome back to the channel. My name's Sunny and today I'm going to teach you all about the useEffect hook and why it has transformed the way that we use functional components and why you need to know it. So today's lesson is actually part of the huge React Basics 101 pack. So the React Basics 101 class is full of value, and I have been able to do something incredible for you guys, and that is to actually release it for absolutely free. Now, the only reason that is possible is thanks to the guys over at Skillshare. Skillshare is an online learning community where millions of people come together to take the next step in their creative journey. The thing I love about Skillshare is that there are no ads. They're always launching new premium classes, and they also recommend really interesting classes. So before you know it, I'm actually no longer watching TV or Netflix. All I do is watch Skillshare while I'm actually eating my food. Most classes are under 60 minutes, so they should be able to fit any schedule, whether you're super busy or you've got a little bit more time on your hands. I've actually gone ahead and dropped the React Basics 101 entire class on Skillshare. The first 1,000 people to use the link in the description are going to get a free month worth of premium Skillshare, and you're going to be able to, with that, access the React Basics which I've uploaded. On top of that, you're going to get access to thousands and thousands of courses available on Skillshare's platform. I've actually been checking out an amazing video editing class at the moment by Ali Abdal, where I was actually able to find out how I could use my iPad to add animated handwriting into my videos to level up my production value. And now I'm making the best use out of my iPad, as well as leveling up my Final Cut production game. So this is just an example of the amazing value that I've got since I've signed up at Skillshare. And if you guys want to go ahead and benefit from this just like I have, then go ahead and remember, the first 1,000 people to go ahead and grab that link are going to get one free month of Skillshare Premium, which means that you can access my React Basics 101 class. It's completely free. You have nothing to lose. And then after that, you can go ahead and continue if you're enjoying what you see on Skillshare. If you enjoy the content that you're seeing, then go ahead and smash the thumbs up button, hit the subscribe and bell notification icon so that way you don't miss any of the future videos. Without further ado, let's roll the React Basics 101 useEffect lesson. Let's do this, Papa Fam. Peace. Today we're going to be talking about the useEffect hook. Now, what is the useEffect hook and why is it so important? It's actually one of the core fundamentals when we're using React. We have to understand how to use a useEffect hook, and we have to know why it's so powerful and the different use cases of when we might need to use it. Now, what does a useEffect do? A useEffect hook simply allows us to perform side effects on a functional component. Now, you might be wondering, that sounds pretty cool, but I have no idea what it really means, okay? Now, in a class-based component, you used to have special functions called Lifecycle methods, okay? So these were things like componentDidMount, componentDidUnmount, componentWillUpdate, and so forth. What this meant was that whenever the component would sort of reach a lifecycle point, for example, when it mounts, when it's about to render, when it's about to re-render, what happens before the re-render, so when it unmounts, what happens when it receives new props. All of these things you could tap into and execute a piece of code based on those lifecycle functions. Now, previously you couldn't do this in functional components, and as we know, the whole code base is shifting to functional components, functional programming. So with that said, the guys over at React introduced the useEffect hook. Now, the useEffect hook literally replaces every single one of those lifecycle functions or methods that I explained just a second ago. Now, we're going to explain all of the different use cases. We're going to break it down. We're going to make it super simple. Get ready, buckle up, get your coffee, let's go and jump into the code without further ado. So what we're going to be doing here is essentially showing you how we have the same component. So this is a functional component. This is a class-based component that resembles the same app, and essentially what we have at the bottom is, with a minor difference of an input field, we have a render block over here. So we have the useEffect hook with the window width for an example in just a sec, and over here we have the same example where we basically go ahead and show the window width, but we simply have an input for demonstration, which I'm going to show you in just a sec. Okay, so with that said, guys, what I'm going to show you is previously in class-based components, this is how you would go ahead and tap into those lifecycle functions that I spoke about. Okay, so we had functions like this, right? componentDidMount, componentDidUpdate, componentWillUnmount. Now, there were some additional lifecycle functions. However, these are three of the most used ones, okay? The first one, what does that resemble? It resembles when the component mounts, okay? So it's a lifecycle function so that we can call a piece of code when the component mounts. For example, in this case, we could just console log the app component loaded, right? Now, this is very important because imagine you wanted to request something from a database, you could do it at this point. Now, we also want to run another piece of code whenever the component updates. So this is where componentDidUpdate used to come in. However, this would run whenever you would basically get a change in props. This became a bit tricky when you're using this lifecycle function. So the useEffect does simplify this, and we're going to go over that in just a sec. The final one I want to talk about is the componentWillUnmount. Now, componentWillUnmount is, as it sounds, before the component's about to re-render, it unmounts first, right? So the lifecycle that you have to expect is that whenever the page loads, the component renders onto the page, and then the user might interact with the page, which may trigger a re-render. But before the page basically repaints, think of it that way, it unmounts that component and then it puts it back on the page, right? So it has to first mount the component onto the page, so that way we see it. Then it's going to receive some kind of interaction or change, and that's going to cause it to unmount the component and then remount it again. And that's what we see as an update. So that's how we get this interactivity or dynamic behavior with React. So we can actually tap into the point that it unmounts with the componentWillUnmount function, okay? So these are the three sort of crucial lifecycle functions that I want you to focus on. Now, in functional components, it's actually very simple, right? So once you understand that the useEffect hook, so this one right here, the useEffect hook, it essentially replaces every single lifecycle function that you may run into, okay? So the question is not if it is capable of doing so, it is capable of doing so. If you have any sort of concerns and you think, I could do this in a class-based component, but I can't do it in a functional, then believe me, you can do it in a functional component. You can do everything inside of a functional component now with our handy friend, the useEffect hook, okay? So let's go through a couple of different variations and what you would use them for and how they compare to the class-based methods that we just spoke about, okay? So we're gonna go ahead and remove our current drawings. And the first one is we have the useEffect for triggering on every render, okay? So firstly, let's understand how we write a useEffect hook. So firstly, you're gonna have to import it from React. That's the first typical step. And then what you're gonna do is type in useEffect. Okay, now useEffect takes some arguments. The first argument is actually a function. Okay, so it's an arrow function. And the second one is optional. Okay, so you don't have to include the second one. And there are reasons for when you want to include it, and there are reasons for when you don't want to include it. And this changes the behavior or the point at which we're tapping into it. So the different lifecycle functions or points in the component cycle that I talked about earlier, this will change that behavior based on the second argument. So here we can pass in something called a dependency list, right? So it's a dependency array. And simply if we leave it blank, it does a certain behavior. If we put in a variable, it has a certain behavior. And if we leave it blank, without any sort of option there, it has a different behavior. So I'm going to run through all of those right now, but this is essentially how we write it. So the first example that I want to talk about is on every render, okay? So if we don't include that second argument, for example, like so, then what we're going to do is I'm going to make this a little bit simpler. Let's just go ahead and say console.log I re-rendered. Right, so this will trigger off every single time the component re-renders. So imagine we had an input field, you type in it, it's going to cause a re-render. So this will go ahead and have that effect. So let's go ahead and go to our component. Let's just type some stuff inside of here. So I'm going to go ahead and comment out my previous console log so that we know that it's coming from this one. So let's go ahead and refresh. And now we can see I re-rendered. And if I type in a bunch of times, you can see every single time I type or some kind of re-rendering happens, it goes ahead and reflects on the page. Okay, so this is what is happening here. Now, this is how we go ahead and tack into that point in the component lifecycle. So this allows us to have this power on every single render. However, this could be quite expensive. We don't always need that. Sometimes we only need to go ahead and render something on the first mount. For example, the componentDidMount method over here, right? The componentDidMount method over here, we need a way of replacing that, and that is over here. So as you can see over here, this useEffect call, what is the difference between this one and this one? So this one you can see has the dependency array inside of it, right? But it has nothing inside the dependency array. And what that tells React is, only run this on the first render, right? So only run it when the component mounts. And after that, if there are subsequent re-renders, don't run that code, right? So it's only when the component mounts, right? And it's only when the component mounts the first time, right? So essentially this right here, by including this empty array dependency, this will go ahead and replace this componentDidMount, okay? So let's go ahead and see that in action. So I'm going to go ahead and say here, console log, and we're going to keep this one for every single re-render. And here I'm going to say, let's just say the component mounted, okay? So now if we go ahead and come back and refresh, it says the component mounted, and obviously that triggers as a re-render as well. But look what happens, guys. If I go ahead and type, the I re-rendered should fire off, the component mounted should not fire off. So let's go ahead and type in perfect. You guys see that? The I re-rendered gets fired off, but the component mounted did exactly as we expected it. It did not fire off again. So that's perfect. And what that will essentially allow us to do is go ahead and replace this lovely snippet over here called the componentDidMount. So we don't actually need this complexity anymore. Now the useEffect can do that, right? So really, really nice stuff. Now let's move over to the second bit where we're going to talk about the componentDidUpdate placement. Okay, so the componentDidUpdate previously only got triggered if the props changed. However, we might want a bit more granular sort of control over this aspect, right? So what we can do is we can actually replace this with the useEffect, but this time we go ahead and we simply include a variable inside of the dependency array. Now this is a array, which means you can include one or as many variables as you want in there. At any time any of those variables changes, it will trigger off this code. Now you can see what we can do is we can include props in here. We can also include pieces of state. We can include anything that we want to go ahead and trigger the re-render for. This makes it essentially a lot clearer, because before, when we saw componentDidUpdate, it wasn't always clear that a re-render was about to happen or not. Okay, so this makes it essentially very, very clear in knowing when that piece of code is going to get triggered. Now, a rule of thumb is that imagine we did not go ahead and include the dependency. However, here we want to say the name changed, right? So we only want to trigger this off when the name changed. If I go ahead and save this and I open up my compiler, you're going to actually see that it warns us, because hang on, you have a dependency in here. Your code is dependent on the name variable, but you haven't included the name variable as a dependency inside of that dependency array. So if you go ahead and check your compiler, it will actually warn you of this. It'll say React hook useEffect has a missing dependency name. Either include it or remove the dependency array. Now, if we remove it, it's going to go ahead and trigger on every re-render, which isn't optimal. So we need to go ahead and pop in the variable that it's dependent on. So that, I hope that makes sense. And imagine we had different ones. Imagine we had another variable called age, for example. Then you would also need to go ahead and include it here. So that way this code reflects the latest values as it's dependent on these two variables. Okay, so whatever variables you use inside of here, whether it's props, pieces of state, they have to go inside of this. Right now, if we go ahead and get rid of the age, because we didn't define a variable, so it would error out. So let's go ahead and do that. And you should see a green little compiled successfully message, and that's perfect, right? So with that said, this one over here, so this over here is going to be responsible for replacing the componentDidUpdate lifecycle method. And it works perfectly, guys. It really, really does. And it makes your code base much simpler, because you look at the useEffect and you know that this code is only going to get fired off when the name variable changes. Now, something to remember, you can see here, it also runs on the first render. Okay, so every single useEffect always fires on the first render, right? So when the component mounts, this is just a rule of thumb. We must understand this. It always will fire once when the component loads, okay? So even if we go back here, and you guys can read the React docs to understand why that happens, but I can go ahead and refresh, and you see the name changed, right? And if as soon as I start typing in, right? So in this input field at the bottom, I have an example where I'm just essentially changing the name variable via a set name, and we're mapping it to the name. So let's go ahead and change the name input. So here it says enter a name. So if I say Sunny, so as soon as I type in, every single time I type in, it re-triggers that code. You see, it says the name changed. Our re-render code, which was in the other useEffect, gets triggered off. And also the one that we just explained now. that will get fired off too, right? So I hope that makes a lot of sense. And that is where we go ahead and essentially replace the componentDidUpdate lifecycle method. Now, the final example, and this is probably the one that may take a few moments to get your head around, is the componentWillUnmount lifecycle function, okay? So how do we replace this with a useEffect? Now, a useEffect allows us to have something called a cleanup function, okay? So in every single useEffect, so let's use this one for an example, what we can do is we can actually return a function from the useEffect, okay? And what this will do is it's known as the cleanup function, okay? Now what this means is before it essentially re-renders, so before, imagine I'm typing into that input field, every single time I type in, it re-renders, right? But before it does that, it actually quickly unmounts the component so that it can re-render another one in its place, right? And we see it happens so quick that it looks dynamic in front of us. But what we can do here is we can actually go ahead and unmount something. So in this case, let's go ahead and demonstrate before the name changes. Let's go ahead and say we unmounted, right? So let's go ahead and do this and save. And what we can do is, and this is actually very powerful because there are going to be cases where, for example, you make a connection to a database and every single time the component re-renders, you don't want to keep making the connection, right? Instead, you have to do a cleanup. You have to disconnect the current connection and then reconnect, or it would even be better to only do it on the first render. Right, so this is where you have to think about these things to know which useEffect or which implementation to use. But let's check this out in action, okay? So I'm going to go ahead and refresh, and let's go ahead and say type in Sunny. So look what happens, guys. It unmounted, it re-rendered, and the name changed. And here, if I go ahead and type in Sunny as such, you can see it happened a bunch of times. The name changed, we unmounted, I re-rendered, the name changed. And then if I go ahead and type in again, it said we unmounted, it re-rendered, and the name changed. Right, so you see what happens here. It has to unmount first, then it goes ahead and updates the name, okay? So this is called the cleanup function. Now I've got a really cool example of how we can show you this one. So what we've done here is I've created a little helper function called const update window width, okay? Now bear with me for a sec. At the top, we've initialized a variable inside of our state called window width, okay? Now what we've done here is essentially we've set the initial value with the window inner width property, okay? So this will actually just return a value which tells us how wide the width of the screen is, okay? And what we've done here is on the first render, so obviously here what we're saying is on the first render, but I'm going to show you something first. We're going to say on every single re-render, I want to add the event listener so that when the user resizes, I update the window width. And this is a function which simply goes ahead and sets the window width to the new window inner width, okay? So every single time it will do that. But let's not have a cleanup function, and I'll show you what happens, okay? So I'm going to go ahead and comment this out. For now, all we can actually do at this point is I'll cut this out, and I'll show you the sort of implications if you do this without correctly cleaning up. So what we're going to see now is, this should actually reflect on the screen, but what we're going to see now is if we go ahead and refresh, you see here it says the window width is 466. So if I go ahead and move it around, you can see it's re-rendering and this is changing value, okay? So our useEffect is working here. It's actually triggering off to update that window value. However, what we're not seeing here is that every single time it triggers that re-render, it's adding an event listener to the resize action with the update window width function, okay? So that's actually quite expensive. Although we might not see any harm here and it works perfectly, what we can actually do is we can run a piece of code inside of our console called get event listeners for window inside of parentheses. And you can see, look, it has 113 listeners. And if I go ahead and drag this around a few more times and I run it, it's going to have another 146 because it re-rendered 33 more times after that, right? And if we do it again, you can see, like, I'm just going to go crazy now. And then let's go ahead and do it again. And we've got another 50 re-renders. So you can see now it's added another 50 resized listeners. This is not ideal and it can extremely impact your performance of your React app, okay? So I'm going to go ahead and refresh and you can see just to prove to you that it starts off with 1. We do this a bunch of times and you can see, for example, 24 re-renders later, we now have 26 inside of our resize listeners, right? Which is not ideal. So there's two ways of fixing this. The first one is with a cleanup function. So let's go ahead and say, okay, before you re-render, let's go ahead and return, so the cleanup function. So when the component mounts, this cleanup code will run. We're going to say remove the event listener that you added with the update window width function. So let's go ahead and do that, right? And let's just see what happens now. So if we refresh, we go ahead and see how many listeners have been attached. Okay, remember, because it runs the first time it mounts. So this is why it is able to work. And let's go ahead and do this a bunch of times. So let's go ahead and move this around so we can see, okay, I've dragged it around a bunch of times. It says I re-rendered. Okay, now let's go ahead and say, get the event listeners. And you can see we only have one. Right, so this is again really nice, and it works really well. Okay, now there are things to consider with this, right? Every single time we do this, it's going to go ahead and let's just say console.log, and let's just say attach listener. Okay, we're going to attach listener at this point, and I'm going to go ahead and copy this, and here I'm going to say detach listener. Right, so you can see, you might be thinking problem solved, right? But look what is actually happening here. Okay, so attach the listener, and then here, if we go ahead and check it, attach that listener, right? Perfect. Now, if I go ahead and resize the screen, you can see what's happening, right? Every single time I do it, although we only have one resize listener available, which is what we wanted, it's actually doing quite a lot of work behind the scenes that we don't even notice, right? It's attaching, retaching, attaching, detaching, attaching, and so forth, right? So this is not ideal. So what you can do is, in this sort of situation, to further optimize your React app, you can go ahead, delete this, go ahead and actually only run this on the mount, right? So remember, it depends on your use case, but in this case, this would actually work perfectly because we only want to attach the event listener once when the component mounts, and then we want to basically go ahead and just carry on with our day. Right, so let's go ahead and save this. And now if I go ahead and check it, refresh, it attached the listener, we can see it's only got one resize array, and then we can go ahead and do this. And now regardless of the number of re-renders, you can see our functionality is perfect, but we don't have any additional resize listeners, nor is it attaching and detaching every time. It only attached once when the component mounted, right? So the example previously that I showed you with the cleanup function will actually replace the component unmount. However, you can see now that it's actually a lot clearer to see that we can further optimize this because of the power that useEffect gives us, and we can actually remove this piece of code and just implement the additional on the mount only to make it further optimized. Okay, so this is extremely important, and it allows us to go ahead and have that fine-grained control over what our app does at different points in its life cycle. Okay, so this was a fundamental part of class-based components, and now as the industry is moving towards functional components, it's really important that you actually go ahead and understand how we can mimic this behavior in functional components with a lot more control and power behind it. Okay, now just a little note to understand, we can have several use effects. That's the first thing. So yes, you can have several use effects, and also multiple effects allows us to separate concerns, right? So one effect could be used for just console logging whenever a re-render occurs. Another effect could be used for attaching that window listener that we spoke about earlier. And you see every single one has its own little purpose, right? Now, I would highly recommend that you go ahead and practice this, as this sort of power allows us to increase the complexity of the app without increasing the difficulty of reading the code base, and it keeps it relatively simple. Okay, now once you're done with this, what I want you to do is I want you to go over to your browser. I want you to go over to the React docs, and I want you to go ahead and give the useEffect section a nice quick read. Okay, now I make this a habit of every single time that you finish one of these tutorials, you go over to the React docs and you make sure that you give this a thorough read, because yes, we went over all of the sort of demonstrations. However, understanding the core fundamentals as to why these things work, why they're important, is going to be a lot more important for your future growth as a developer. So here it explains a few examples. It shows you the cleanup effects. It shows you the timings and the sort of ways that you can fire it. For example, conditionally firing an effect based on, in this case, the props.source. Okay, in this case, it's going to fire off based on the source prop changing and so forth, right? Now they have some important different notes that you should read, but I would make this a habit that every time you finish one of these lessons, you come over here, give it a nice quick read, and that way you can solidify what we just went through today. Okay, so I recommend that you do this exercise, you code this out, and you get everything working and test it for yourself. And yeah, guys, that's going to help you concrete this knowledge and get good with it. Okay, so that was this lesson, and it was a very important lesson on the useEffect hooks. In the next lesson, we're actually going to do something pretty fun. We're going to build our very own custom hook, right? It's going to be a use random joke generator. So it's going to be a lot of fun. It's going to make a fetch to an API service, and then it's going to do some cool stuff with that. So until then, guys, I will see you in the next lesson. Carry on working hard, and I will see you later, Papa Fam. Peace.